The crystal chandeliers of the St. Regis Ballroom cast a flawless glow over Abigail Reed, the undisputed queen of Reed Pharmaceuticals, as she smiled for the cameras. Yet, beneath the clinking of champagne flutes and the rustle of designer silk, the faint, rhythmic static of a hidden audio file hummed on her husband's phone, a digital confession of everything she had done in the dark. A grand empire was about to burn to the ground, fueled by her own recorded whispers. If stories of shattered perfection, dangerous secrets, and the heavy price of betrayal resonate with you, stay with me as this unravels. There is so much more hiding behind these closed doors. Don't leave just yet. The penthouse was exactly as it always was, immaculate, temperature-controlled, and drowning in an oppressive, expensive silence. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Boston skyline glittered through a steady, late-night drizzle, smearing the headlights on Storrow Drive into ribbons of blurred gold. Samir Hassan stood in the center of the living room, loosening his silk tie. He was exhausted. It was a bone-deep weariness that came not just from his own architectural firm, but from the relentless, invisible labor of being Abigail Reed's husband. To be married to the CEO of Reed Pharmaceuticals meant functioning as a steady satellite in her orbit, always present, always supportive, never casting a shadow over her brilliance. He walked into the master bedroom. The scent of her, Tom Ford's oud wood mingled with the sterile air of the AC, still lingered. She was out. A sudden, unavoidable dinner with the board. She had texted him 3 hours ago. "Keep the bed warm for me, darling," the message had read. As Samir moved to place his watch on the nightstand, a soft pulse of light caught his eye. Abigail's personal tablet, the one she rarely let out of her sight, was wedged half under a stack of quarterly reports. It was vibrating. A low battery warning. Instinctively, Samir picked it up to plug it into the charger. He didn't mean to pry. In 7 years of marriage, he had never once felt the urge to search through her digital life. They had trust. Or rather, they had a flawlessly choreographed understanding of one another. His thumb brushed the screen. The biometric sensor, which she had programmed with his print years ago so he could read the news on Sunday mornings, unlocked the device with a quiet click. The screen didn't open to the Wall Street Journal or her relentless email inbox. It opened to an app Samir didn't recognize. The interface was entirely black, minimalist, with a simple list of audio files. No titles, just dates and timestamps. Samir frowned, his thumb hovering over the glass. The most recent file was dated today, 3:15 p.m. Curiosity, cold and sudden, spiked in his chest. At 3:15 p.m., Abigail was supposed to be in a closed-door strategy session regarding the new FDA trials. He knew this because she had canceled their quick coffee date due to the conflict. He tapped the file. The audio began with a sharp intake of breath, the rustle of fabric. Then, a voice. "God, don't stop. Please." Samir froze. The world outside the window seemed to halt. The rain stopped hitting the glass. The hum of the air conditioning vanished. There was only the sound emanating from the small speaker in his hand. It was Abigail's voice. But it was stripped of the corporate polish, the measured cadence she used in boardrooms and at charity dinners. This voice was breathless, raw, and trembling, with a kind of desperate surrender he hadn't heard from her in years. "I told him I was in a meeting," Abigail's recorded voice murmured, followed by a low, masculine chuckle that sent a shard of ice directly into Samir's veins. It wasn't him. It wasn't a movie. It was a recording, clear and undeniable. "He never asks questions," she continued, the audio capturing the intimate, sickening sound of lips against skin. "He's too busy admiring the pedestal he put me on to look underneath it." Samir's hand began to shake. He couldn't breathe. The oxygen in the sprawling, $10 million penthouse had suddenly evaporated. He stared at the screen as the timestamp ticked forward. 30 seconds, 40 seconds, a minute of undeniable, devastating betrayal. He didn't scream. He didn't throw the tablet against the marble wall. Instead, a profound, chilling numbness washed over he. He looked down at the list of files. There were dozens of them, going back months, a meticulously catalogued archive of his own humiliation. He stopped the audio. The silence of the penthouse rushed back in, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a grave. The tablet screen dimmed, then went completely black, plunging the master bedroom back into the heavy, suffocating shadows of the rainy night. Samir did not move. He remained seated on the edge of the California king bed, the device resting flat against his palms. His breathing was shallow, barely disturbing the quiet air of the room. The silence he had always found peaceful now felt like a physical weight, pressing against his chest until his lungs burned. He needed to know it was real. A part of his mind, desperate and fracturing, tried to rationalize what he had just heard. A script practice? A bizarre therapy exercise? But he knew Abigail. He knew the specific, breathless cadence of her voice when she lost control, a sound he thought belonged exclusively to him. His thumb pressed the screen, waking the device. The stark, black interface of the hidden app glared back at him. Dozens of files, an entire secret history neatly organized by date. His hand hovered over a file from 3 months ago, right around the time they had celebrated their anniversary in Martha's Vineyard. He tapped it. "It's exhausting," Abigail's voice whispered through the small speaker. There were no background noises of a hotel room this time, just the hollow acoustics of a car interior. "We had the anniversary dinner tonight. Samir was perfect. He always is. He bought me a necklace I'll never wear, and gave a toast that made the table tear up." A pause on the recording, a heavy sigh. "And all I could think about was you," she continued, her tone shifting into something cold, almost resentful. "All I could think about was the way you pushed me against the wall in the archive room at the conference. Samir is safe. He's a beautiful, well-behaved golden retriever guarding the house. But you make me feel like I'm burning. I need that. The company expects me to be flawless. But with you, I can just be ruthless." Samir shut his eyes. The words were a surgical blade, sliding effortlessly through years of devotion, compromise, and quiet sacrifices he had made to support her rise as the CEO of Reed Pharmaceuticals. She didn't just betray his body, she despised his goodness. She viewed his unwavering loyalty not as a foundation, but as a cage of boredom. He dropped the tablet onto the mattress, as if it were burning his skin. Standing up, his legs felt strangely numb, disconnected from his body. He walked out of the bedroom, wandering into the cavernous living space of the penthouse. The city of Boston glowed through the rain-streaked glass, indifferent to the absolute ruin occurring behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. Samir walked past the custom-built mahogany dining table, past the abstract paintings Abigail had curated with a pretentious art dealer last spring, past the framed photograph of them smiling at the Boston Ballet Gala. He stopped in the kitchen, leaning his weight against the cold, imported Italian marble of the island. He stared at his reflection in the darkened glass of the oven door. He expected to look different, older, broken, shattered. But he looked exactly the same. The immaculately tailored trousers, the crisp dress shirt, the silver wedding band catching the ambient light of the city. The nausea hit him then, a violent, physical rejection of the life he was standing in. Everything in this $10 million home was a stage set, and he was the only actor who hadn't known the play was a tragedy. He looked down at the gold band on his left hand. For the first time in 7 years, it felt heavy. It felt like a chain. The global headquarters of Reed Pharmaceuticals occupied the top 10 floors of a glass and steel monolith in the Seaport District. It was a space designed to intimidate, all brushed chrome, polished concrete, and panoramic views of the Atlantic Ocean. It smelled faintly of ozone and expensive espresso. Samir stepped out of the private elevator on the executive floor just before noon. In his left hand, he carried a sealed manila envelope containing a set of estate planning documents Abigail had supposedly forgotten to sign the night before. It was a flimsy excuse to be here, but Samir needed to see her. He needed to look at his wife in the harsh, unforgiving daylight of her own kingdom, to see if he could spot the monster he had listened to the previous night. He didn't make it to her office. Samir, what a rare midday surprise. Amanda Foster stepped out from behind a frosted glass partition, a stack of heavily redacted clinical trial files resting in her arms. Amanda was Abigail's chief of staff, a woman whose entire existence was dedicated to ensuring the frictionless operation of the CEO's life. She possessed a terrifyingly sharp mind and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "Amanda," Samir said, forcing the corners of his mouth to turn upward into the familiar, easy smile he had worn for 7 years. "I know she's swamped. Just dropping off the trust revisions, she left them on the kitchen island." He extended the envelope. Amanda took it, But she didn't immediately look down. Instead, her gaze lingered on his face. The silence between them stretched for a fraction of a second too long. In the past, Samir would have filled the quiet space with polite inquiries about Amanda's weekend or a joke about the oppressive corporate air conditioning. Today, he said nothing. He simply stood there, the ambient noise of ringing phones and clicking heels washing over them. "She's in the boardroom with the legal team," Amanda said smoothly, her voice a perfectly modulated professional purr. "Prepping for the gala announcements. I'll make sure these get on her desk." "Thank you," Samir nodded, turning toward the elevator bank. "Samir," Amanda called out softly. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her head tilted just a fraction of an inch. "You look tired." It was a test. Amanda didn't ask questions out of genuine concern. She asked them to measure the variables in Abigail's environment. Samir felt a cold bead of sweat trace a line down his spine. He realized then that he wasn't just dealing with Abigail. He was dealing with a meticulously constructed machine designed to protect her at all costs. If he showed even a sliver of the devastation tearing through his chest, Amanda would flag it as a threat. "Just a late night reviewing CAD blueprints for the new library project," Samir lied, keeping his voice entirely flat and devoid of defense. "Tell Abigail I'll see her at home." Of course, Amanda's expression remained perfectly neutral, but her eyes tracked his every movement as he stepped into the elevator. As the stainless steel doors slid shut, sealing him away from the executive floor, the facade Samir had hastily constructed finally cracked. He leaned heavily against the back wall of the elevator car, his breath escaping in a ragged exhale. Upstairs, Amanda walked slowly back to her desk, the manila envelope tapping rhythmically against her thigh. She glanced toward the closed doors of the boardroom where Abigail was holding court. Samir had smiled. He had delivered his lines perfectly, and his suit was immaculately pressed. But Amanda had noticed the one detail he hadn't been able to control. When Samir had handed her the envelope, his hands hadn't possessed their usual, relaxed warmth. His knuckles were white, the tendons strained, as if he were fighting the urge to tear the paper to shreds. Amanda sat down, opening a secure encrypted chat window on her monitor. She didn't type anything yet. She merely watched the blinking cursor, a quiet alarm bell ringing in the back of his mind. Something was fundamentally broken, and whatever it was going to cost them. The walk-in closet in the master suite was larger than the first apartment Samir had rented in Cambridge. It was a cathedral of custom mahogany and soft, recessed lighting, neatly divided between Abigail's designer collections and his own meticulously tailored suits. Samir stood in the center of it, staring at the perfectly aligned rows of garments. He reached past the row of Italian wool jackets and pulled out a battered, dark brown leather duffel bag from the top shelf. It was a relic from his graduate school days, an item he had owned long before he was absorbed into the gravity of the Reed empire. The leather was scuffed, the brass zipper slightly oxidized. It felt real in a way that nothing else in the penthouse did. Samir packed with a cold, mechanical efficiency. He did not take the cashmere sweaters she had bought him in Milan, nor the diamond-encrusted cufflinks from their 5th anniversary. He packed the worn denim, the plain cotton shirts, his drafting pencils, and the old architectural journals he had kept since his 20s. He was shedding the skin of Abigail Reed's husband, layer by layer, until only the man he used to be remained. His phone, resting on the velvet-lined accessory island, vibrated with a short, sharp buzz. "Abigail, dinner ran over. Traffic on the Mass Ave bridge is a nightmare. Home in 20. Pour me a glass of the Bordeaux. Love you." Samir stared at the screen. The casual intimacy of the message, the routine expectation of his service, made his stomach turn. 20 minutes. He had 20 minutes before the illusion shattered, before she walked through the door expecting the golden retriever she had mocked on those tapes. He zipped the duffel bag. The harsh, metallic sound was deafening in the quiet room. Swinging the strap over his shoulder, Samir walked out of the bedroom for the last time. He moved through the expansive living room, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. He didn't look at the sweeping view of the Boston skyline, nor did he cast a second glance at the life they had built together. The penthouse, with all its flawless curation and temperature-controlled air, felt like a beautifully designed tomb. He stopped in the kitchen, setting the duffel bag down on the floor. Samir looked at his left hand. The gold wedding band caught the dim light emanating from the hallway. For 7 years, it had been a symbol of his anchor, his devotion, his unwavering belief in the woman he had promised his life to. Now, it was just a piece of metal, heavy and cold. He gripped the ring with his right hand and twisted it. It was tight, resisting his pull, clinging to the knuckle. With a final sharp tug, it slid off. Beneath it, the skin of his ring finger was smooth, pale, and slightly indented, a ghost of a commitment that no longer existed. Samir placed the gold band squarely in the center of the dark, veined marble of the kitchen island. Beside it, he laid the heavy silver fob to the Porsche she had purchased for his 35th birthday and the electronic keycard to the penthouse. He didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say that she hadn't already destroyed. Samir picked up his bag, walked to the heavy oak front door, and pulled it open. He stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him. The lock engaged with a solid, echoing click. As the private elevator descended, dropping him away from the sky and down to the street level, the crushing weight in his chest finally began to fracture. He stepped out onto the damp, rain-slicked pavement of the city. The cold air hit his face, sharp and biting. Samir Hassan walked into the Boston night, disappearing into the anonymity of the shadows. A ghost leaving a haunted house behind. The private elevator doors opened with a soft, melodic chime, delivering Abigail Reed directly into the foyer of her penthouse. She stepped out, her black patent leather stilettos clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. She was exhausted, but it was a victorious kind of exhaustion. The board had approved the new R&D budget, and the hour she had spent afterward in a discreet hotel room in Back Bay had smoothed the remaining edges of her corporate anxiety. "Samir?" she called out, dropping her trench coat carelessly over the back of a Barcelona chair. The penthouse offered no reply. The ambient lighting was set to its usual evening dimness, casting long, elegant shadows across the expansive living room. The rain continued to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows, obscuring the city lights. Abigail frowned, rubbing her temples. She walked toward the kitchen, expecting to find the bottle of Bordeaux open and breathing on the counter, just as she had requested. Instead, the kitchen was immaculately clean and completely undisturbed. The wine rack remained untouched. A flicker of genuine irritation crossed her features. Samir was never unreliable. His predictability was the very trait she relied upon to balance the chaotic demands of her life. He was the anchor that allowed her to sail into dangerous waters without fear of drifting away. For him to simply ignore a request was unheard of. "Samir, I really don't have the energy for a sulk tonight," she said aloud, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. She rounded the corner of the massive marble island and stopped abruptly. Sitting dead center under the ambient pendant light was a small, precise arrangement of objects. A heavy silver Porsche fob, a black electronic keycard, and a simple gold wedding band. Abigail stared at the metal ring. Her brain, usually capable of processing complex pharmaceutical data in seconds, seemed to stall. She reached out, the tips of her manicured fingers brushing the cold gold. A sudden, inexplicable chill radiated up her arm. He left. The thought was absurd. Samir didn't leave. He loved her with a blind, encompassing devotion that she had secretly found pathetic, even as she exploited it. He had no reason to leave. They had kissed that morning. He had made her coffee. Everything had been perfectly, agonizingly normal. Unless... The breath caught in Abigail's throat. A cold sweat broke out along her hairline. She spun around, her heels slipping slightly on the polished floor, and practically ran down the hallway toward the master suite. She ignored the open door to his walk-in closet, ignoring the empty space where his old duffel bag usually sat. She burst into the bedroom. Her eyes immediately darted to the nightstand. There, plugged into the charger, was her personal tablet. Abigail walked toward it slowly, as if approaching a live explosive. She never left it out. She always kept it locked in her leather briefcase. But she had been in such a rush to leave for the board meeting, her mind already anticipating the illicit afternoon ahead, that she had carelessly shoved it under some reports. She picked it up. Her hands, which hadn't trembled during the most brutal corporate negotiations of her career, were shaking violently. She pressed her thumb to the sensor. The screen unlocked instantly. It did not open to her emails. It did not open to her calendar. The screen illuminated the dark, minimalist interface of her secure audio vault. The file at the very top of the list, dated earlier that afternoon, was highlighted. The playback bar was dragged all the way to the end. Abigail dropped the tablet. It clattered against the hardwood floor, the screen cracking in a jagged web across the glass. She stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the mattress, and sank down onto the floor. The silence of the penthouse was no longer a luxury. It was a physical pressure, crushing the air from her lungs. Samir knew. He knew everything. He had heard her voice, heard the breathless betrayals, heard her mock the very foundation of their life together. And he hadn't screamed. He hadn't confronted her. He had simply placed his ring on the counter and vanished into the night, taking all her secrets with him. As the rain battered the glass high above Boston, the undisputed queen of Reed Pharmaceuticals pulled her knees to her chest, realizing for the first time in her life that she was entirely at someone else's mercy. The room at the fading motor lodge off Route 1 smelled of industrial pine cleaner and stale cigarette smoke, a scent that had seeped into the floral wallpaper decades ago. It was a jarring, almost offensive contrast to the filtered, cedar-scented air of the Boston penthouse. But to Samir, the sterile ugliness of the space was necessary. It was an aesthetic reflection of what his life had become. He sat at a scarred laminate desk, illuminated only by the harsh blue glare of a newly purchased laptop. Outside, the steady drone of highway traffic blended with the rhythmic hum of a struggling mini-fridge. He had not slept in 3 days. Dark bruised crescents hung beneath his eyes, and the shadow of a thick stubble darkened his jawline. A half-empty cup of cold, bitter diner coffee sat perilously close to his elbow. On the screen, a digital audio workstation application was open. The interface was a complex grid of timelines and frequencies. Across the center of the screen, a jagged, neon-green waveform stretched from left to right, a topographical map of his shattered marriage. Samir pressed the spacebar. "He's too busy admiring the pedestal he put me on to look underneath it." Abigail's voice, compressed and slightly metallic through the laptop's cheap speakers, filled the small room. Samir didn't flinch. The first 50 times he had played that specific clip, it had felt like a physical blow to the sternum, stealing his breath and sending a hot flush of nausea through his gut. But human endurance is a terrifying mechanism. Repeated exposure to the trauma had slowly cauterized the wound. The blinding, chaotic pain of the first night had receded, leaving behind a cold, geometric emptiness. He moved the mouse, highlighting the silence before the word pedestal, and hit the delete key. The waveform snapped together. He adjusted the equalization, rolling off the low-end rumble of the car engine in the background to make the crisp, cruel consonants of her whisper razor-sharp. He was an architect by trade. For 15 years, he had made a living designing structures that were functional, enduring, and beautiful. He understood load-bearing walls, stress points, and the precise amount of force required to bring a foundation down. What he was doing now was no different. He was drafting a demolition plan. He opened another file, dragging it into the timeline. This one was from a Tuesday afternoon in late September. He scrubbed through the audio, skipping the breathless gasps and the rustle of clothing, searching for the narrative thread. He found it near the end of the recording. "The gala is in 2 months, Abigail's voice murmured, languid and satisfied. "I just need to keep playing the perfect power couple until the board confirms the new equity structure. Once the shares vest, Samir becomes manageable, a known variable." Samir paused the playback. A known variable. He stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. In Abigail's meticulously curated world, he was not a partner. He was an asset to be managed, a strategic placeholder designed to project stability while she engaged in corporate and personal ruthlessness. She had built her empire on his unblinking trust. He highlighted the clip, snipped it, and dragged it neatly next to the first. He worked methodically through the night, a ghost in a cheap hotel room, stitching together a flawless, undeniable narrative of deceit. He stripped away the ambient noise, leaving only the pure, toxic essence of her confession. He was no longer the golden retriever she had mocked. He had become the fire that would burn her immaculate house to the ground. 4 days had passed since the gold ring was left on the cold marble island. 4 days of an agonizing, absolute silence that Abigail Reed had never experienced in her 38 years of life. She sat behind her expansive glass desk on the 50th floor of the Reed Pharmaceuticals tower, staring blindly at a quarterly projection report. The numbers and graphs on the high-resolution monitor were just meaningless, glowing static. Her phone, resting precisely 2 inches from her left hand, remained completely dark. No texts, no calls from a divorce attorney, nothing. It was a psychological warfare of attrition, and for the first time in her career, she was losing. A sharp knock on the frosted glass door shattered the quiet. Before Abigail could respond, Amanda Foster stepped into the office. She carried a sleek leather-bound tablet and a familiar, unreadable expression. "The catering finalizations for the St. Regis," Amanda said, her voice a calm, professional murmur that somehow always commanded the room. "They need the final head count by noon. Specifically, they need to confirm if Samir requires the vegetarian option or the sea bass." Abigail's heart executed a painful, erratic stutter against her ribs. She carefully picked up her heavy Mont Blanc pen, gripping the cool metal tightly to stop her fingers from trembling. She looked up, arranging her features into a flawless mask of mild, elegant irritation. "Neither," Abigail said smoothly. "Samir won't be attending." Amanda stopped in the center of the expansive room. The subtle shift in her posture was microscopic, but to someone as attuned to power dynamics as Abigail, it was deafening. "He won't be attending the Reed Gala, the event he has co-hosted for the last 5 years. A sudden architectural retreat," Abigail lied, the words tasting like copper and ash in her mouth. "A restorative design project in Portland. An old mentor of his requested his immediate presence. It was entirely unavoidable." Amanda did not look down at her tablet to adjust the seating chart. Instead, her sharp, dark eyes locked onto Abigail's face. She let the silence stretch, a deliberate, suffocating tactic she usually reserved for hostile board members. Abigail felt a bead of cold sweat form at the base of her neck. She knew Amanda remembered Samir's strange, hollow demeanor in the hallway earlier that week, the uncharacteristic tension, the white-knuckled grip on the envelope. "A retreat," Amanda repeated slowly, testing the weight and the fragility of the word. "I see. Should I have public relations draft a brief statement? The investors expect to see the supportive husband. His absence will undoubtedly be noted by the press." "No statement," Abigail snapped, a fraction too quickly, the sharp edge of her panic bleeding through the polish. She forced a tired, dismissive sigh, leaning back in her ergonomic leather chair. "It's a gala, Amanda, not a state dinner. Adjust the seating at the head table. Put Senator Hayes in Samir's chair." "Understood." Amanda tapped the screen of her tablet, her face betraying nothing. "I will handle the logistics. Is there anything else you need? You seem fatigued today." "I am fine. Just focus on the St. Regis preparations." As Amanda turned and exited the office, the heavy door closing with a soft, pneumatic hiss, the carefully constructed mask on Abigail's face dissolved instantly. She dropped the heavy pen onto the glass desk. It landed with a loud, jarring clatter that echoed in the empty room. She swiveled her chair to face the panoramic window. The Boston skyline stretched out below her, a sprawling, glittering empire she had conquered through sheer will and ruthless intelligence. But looking down at the crawling traffic and the steel towers, she felt entirely disconnected from it. The gala was in 72 hours. It was meant to be her crowning achievement, the night she solidified her absolute control over the company's future. But the silence Samir had left behind was expanding, a dark, heavy mass consuming all the oxygen in her life. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting a sudden, terrifying wave of nausea. She was Abigail Reed. She did not panic, but deep in the hollow ache of her chest, she knew the truth. She was standing on a floor of glass, and she could hear it beginning to splinter. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a symphony of coordinated chaos. 48 hours before the annual Reed Gala, the cavernous space smelled of industrial floor wax, ozone from the heavy lighting rigs, and the faint, sweet scent of thousands of imported white hydrangeas waiting in climate-controlled staging areas. Samir Hassan walked through the service entrance off the loading dock, his head down, carrying a clipboard and a coiled length of Cat6 cable. He wore a nondescript black fleece and a faded, laminated vendor badge from a media production company he had contracted 3 years ago. Amidst the frantic energy of caterers, florists, and union stagehands, a man moving with purpose and technical equipment was invisible. He knew this building's nervous system intimately. 6 years ago, Abigail had leveraged his architectural firm to redesign the acoustic baffling of this exact ballroom. He knew the blind spots in the security camera coverage. He knew that the primary audiovisual control booth, suspended above the balcony level, was often left unattended during the chaotic load-in phase while technicians argued over sightlines on the floor. Samir slipped up the narrow, carpeted maintenance stairs, his heart beating in a slow, heavy rhythm that felt entirely foreign to him. The booth was empty, bathed in the low hum of server cooling fans and the cool blue glow of the master control monitors. Through the soundproof glass, he could see the massive LED screen spanning the width of the main stage below. He sat down in the technician's ergonomic chair. His hands, which had trembled violently the night he found the tablet, were now terrifyingly steady. He pulled a matte black USB drive from his pocket and slotted it into the master media server. The directory popped up on the screen. It took him less than 30 seconds to locate the primary sequence folder. There it was, read.gala, promo, final.mp4. It was a highly produced, 10-minute documentary designed to showcase Abigail's visionary leadership and secure the upcoming round of global investments. Samir dragged his own file from the USB drive. He had spent the last 3 nights meticulously merging his edited audio of Abigail's raw, breathless confessions into a duplicate of the promotional video, matching the exact file size, frame rate, and metadata. To the system, and to any technician doing a surface-level check, it was the identical file. He clicked Replace. A gray dialog box appeared on the screen, asking for confirmation to overwrite the existing media. Samir's finger hovered over the mouse. He looked down through the glass at the stage. A ghost of a memory flickered in his mind. Abigail standing on that very spot last year, wearing a sapphire gown, gripping his hand tightly just out of the camera's view, whispering that she couldn't build this without him. The memory did not bring warmth. It brought a cold, sharp clarity. It had all been a performance. He was merely a prop on her stage. He clicked Confirm. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 10%, 45%, 80%. When the transfer was complete, Samir didn't stop there. Drawing on his deep knowledge of digital infrastructure, he quickly bypassed the local administrator privileges and ran a small, pre-written script into the soundboard's routing matrix. Once the video file executed on the timeline, the audio feed would lock. The master volume faders on the physical desk would be bypassed. The only way to stop the sound from echoing through the ballroom's massive line array speakers would be to cut the secondary power grid to the entire floor, a process that would take a frantic technician at least 3 full minutes to figure out. 3 minutes was a lifetime. 3 minutes was all he needed. Samir ejected the drive, slipped it back into his pocket, and stood up. He walked down the maintenance stairs and out through the loading dock into the biting chill of the Boston afternoon. He blended seamlessly into the city crowds, leaving behind a flawless, invisible trap ticking silently in the dark. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a sensory masterpiece of wealth and influence. 500 of Boston's most powerful figures sat at tables draped in heavy white linen, the ambient lighting catching the brilliance of diamond necklaces and the golden amber of aged bourbon. The air was thick with the scent of roasted sea bass, expensive perfumes, and the quiet, electric hum of pending investments. Standing in the wings, Abigail Reed smoothed the front of her emerald silk gown. She looked flawless, her armor of haute couture perfectly concealing the agonizing, suffocating panic that had consumed her for the past week. Samir's absence had been noted, whispered about during the cocktail hour, but Amanda Foster had ruthlessly managed the narrative. A sudden architectural emergency. A brilliant husband called away on a passion project. The lie had held. "You're on in 30 seconds, Amanda murmured, stepping out of the shadows. Her eyes, usually analytical and cold, swept over Abigail with a rare flicker of genuine approval. "The board is entirely charmed. Bring it home, Abigail." "Always," Abigail whispered, her chin lifting. The master of ceremonies announced her name. The applause that followed was not merely polite, it was a roaring endorsement of her power. Abigail walked out from the wings, the heavy spotlight tracking her movement, bathing her in a warm, triumphant glow. She stepped up to the acrylic podium, smiling out at the sea of faces, feeling the familiar, intoxicating rush of absolute control. "Tonight, we do not just celebrate the legacy of Reed Pharmaceuticals," Abigail began, her voice resonating with perfectly practiced warmth and authority, through the state-of-the-art acoustic system. We look toward a future built on transparency, unyielding dedication, and trust. Because without trust, the foundations we build our lives upon are nothing more than glass. She paused, letting the silence emphasize her point, entirely unaware of the tragic irony of her own words. I invite you now to look at the screen, she continued, gesturing gracefully toward the massive LED display suspended above the stage, and see the future we are building together. Abigail stepped back as the main ballroom lights dimmed to a dramatic, expectant black. The screen flared to life. The Reed Pharmaceuticals logo spun in high-definition silver, accompanied by a soaring orchestral swell of music. Then, the music stuttered. It was a harsh, digital tear in the audio, a jarring pop that caused several board members in the front row to flinch. The beautiful sweeping drone footage of the new research facility froze on the screen, pixelated violently into a cascade of green blocks, and then vanished. The massive screen went completely dead black. A murmur of confusion rippled through the dark ballroom. Abigail's smile faltered, her eyes darting toward the control booth suspended in the balcony, but the glass was opaque. From the line array speakers, the very speakers Samir had engineered to deliver flawless, inescapable sound to every corner of the room, came the sharp, distinct sound of a jagged intake of breath. God, don't stop, please. The voice echoed with terrifying clarity. It was not a corporate presentation. It was raw, breathless, and soaked in a desperate physical surrender. It was, undeniably and unmistakably, Abigail Reed. The murmurs in the ballroom ceased instantly. The silence that fell over the 500 guests was absolute, a collective paralysis born of pure shock. Champagne flutes halted inches from open mouths. I told him I was in a meeting. Abigail's recorded voice whispered through the dark, massive room. The intimate friction of skin and fabric, amplified to an obscene volume. A low masculine laugh, distinctly not belonging to Samir Hassan, followed her words. He never asks questions. He's too busy admiring the pedestal he put me on to look underneath it. Abigail stood frozen in the center of the stage, the single spotlight still illuminating her. She could not breathe. The oxygen had been violently sucked from the room. She stared out into the darkness, able to see the horrified, wide eyes of the investors in the front row. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to demand the audio be cut, but her throat was completely closed. With you, I can just be ruthless, the audio continued, cold and damning, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. In the wings, Amanda Foster was frantically screaming into her headset, her usual composure shattered into absolute panic. But it was too late. The trap had closed. Standing under the glaring light, surrounded by the echoes of her own sins, Abigail Reed realized with a crushing, absolute certainty that her husband had not just left her, he had buried her alive. The seconds following the initial shock did not move in real time. They fractured, stretching into a slow, agonizing surrealism. Under the punishing glare of the single-stage spotlight, Abigail Reed felt her body go entirely numb. The St. Regis Ballroom, normally a cathedral of murmured sycophancy and calculated networking, had become an execution chamber. I just need to keep playing the perfect power couple until the board confirms the new equity structure. The audio bounced off the vaulted ceiling, the high-fidelity sound system Samir had designed, reproducing every cruel, mocking inflection of her voice with devastating clarity. In the front row, Senator Hayes slowly lowered his crystal champagne flute to the linen table, his expression morphing from polite interest to a severe, uncomfortable distance. Beside him, the lead investor from a prominent New York venture capital firm leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Abigail not with pity, but with the cold, calculating assessment of a man watching a bad investment plummet to zero. Once the shares vest, Samir becomes manageable, a known variable. Cut the feed! The scream tore through the ambient horror of the room. It was Amanda Foster. The typically unflappable chief of staff had abandoned all corporate decorum. She was sprinting in her designer heels toward the heavy velvet drapes masking the maintenance stairs, her face pale with an unprecedented terror. Cut the main power! Do it now! Amanda shrieked into her headset, her voice cracking, but the unseen technician in the suspended booth was locked out. Samir's script was flawless. The digital confession rolled on, an unstoppable avalanche of betrayal. Abigail could not move her legs. The instinct to flee, to run off the stage and hide in the shadows, was paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of the public humiliation. She looked out into the sea of 500 faces. These were her peers, her rivals, the people she had spent a decade outmaneuvering. Now, they were witnesses to her absolute undoing. She saw shock in some eyes, but mostly, she saw the ravenous, illuminated gleam of scandal. The Reed Empire was bleeding out on the polished hardwood floor, and the sharks were already circling. "I can just be ruthless." Suddenly, with a violent, booming thud that vibrated through the floorboards, the entire ballroom went pitch black. Someone, likely Amanda or a desperate stagehand, had bypassed the booth and physically severed the main electrical breaker for the floor. The deafening audio was instantly choked off. The blinding spotlight vanished. But the darkness offered no sanctuary. The silence lasted for only a fraction of a second before the room erupted. It was a cacophony of overlapping voices, scraping chairs, and the frantic glow of hundreds of smartphone screens illuminating the dark as people immediately began texting, tweeting, and calling. The scandal was already escaping the room, spreading like a virus through the digital veins of Boston's corporate elite. In the chaotic gloom, a hand gripped Abigail's forearm with bruising force. "We have to go, now." Amanda's voice was a harsh hiss next to her ear. Abigail allowed herself to be pulled backward, stumbling off the acrylic podium. Her emerald silk gown, which had felt like armor just 3 minutes ago, now felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud. As she was dragged into the shadows of the backstage wings, leaving the ruined gala behind, Abigail realized the most terrifying truth of all. Samir hadn't just destroyed her career, he had let the world know exactly what she was ensuring: she could never wear the crown again. The freight elevator descended with a harsh, mechanical grind, a stark contrast to the silent, frictionless movement of the executive lifts Abigail was accustomed to. Amanda had shoved her inside, slamming the grate shut and hitting the button for the sub-level loading dock before sprinting back toward the lobby to manage the catastrophic fallout. Abigail leaned against the scratched steel wall of the elevator, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Her emerald silk gown was torn at the hem, where a heel had caught it in the dark. The ambient temperature dropped severely as the doors rattled open, exposing her to the cavernous, concrete expanse of the hotel's rear loading bays. It smelled of diesel exhaust, damp cardboard, and the bitter, freezing rain of the Boston night. She stepped out into the dim glow of the flickering fluorescent safety lights, shivering violently as the wind bit through the thin fabric of her dress. "The valet won't be down here, Abigail." The voice emerged from the deep shadows near a massive industrial dumpster. It was calm, devoid of any adrenaline or malice. It was the voice of a man who had already finished his work. Abigail stopped, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Samir stepped out of the darkness. He was wearing a nondescript black fleece, his hands shoved deeply into the pockets of his dark jeans. The collar of his jacket was turned up against the wind. He did not look like the immaculately tailored husband who used to pour her Bordeaux and massage her shoulders after board meetings. He looked like a stranger, cold and entirely untouchable. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the heavy, rhythmic hum of the building's backup generators. "Why?" Abigail's voice broke. It was barely a whisper, stripped of the commanding resonance she had used on stage just minutes ago. "You could have taken half the assets. You could have destroyed me in divorce court. Why? Why this?" Samir looked at her. His dark eyes, which had once held a boundless, almost pathetic devotion, were completely empty. There was no rage left in them. That, more than the public humiliation, sent a terrifying chill through her blood. "Because a divorce would have allowed you to keep the narrative," Samir said softly, his breath misting in the freezing air. "You would have spun it, a tragic separation of two ambitious minds. You would have kept the crown, the board, the empire. You would have walked away clean, leaving me as a quiet footnote in your biography." He took a slow step forward, the soles of his boots scraping against the concrete. "You built that entire empire on my blind trust," he continued, his tone clinical. "You mocked my loyalty to a man who didn't even know my name. I didn't want your assets, Abigail. I just wanted to remove the foundation you were standing on." Abigail wrapped her arms around her waist, physically trying to hold herself together as the adrenaline crashed, leaving her utterly hollow. The reality of what she had lost was crashing down with the weight of concrete. "You've killed me," she whispered, a single tear cutting a warm track through the cold makeup on her cheek. "My career, my reputation, it's all gone. Are you satisfied, Samir? Does this make you feel whole again?" Samir stared at her shivering frame, at the ruined emerald silk, at the tears slipping from her eyes. He searched his chest for a flicker of triumph, for the vindication he had promised himself during those long, agonizing nights in the cheap motel. He found absolutely nothing. There was only a vast, dark emptiness where his love for her used to reside. "No," Samir replied, his voice dropping to a quiet, devastating monotone. "But I am finished." He didn't wait for a response. He turned his back on her, walking toward the ramp that led up to the rain-slicked alleyway and the pulsing city lights beyond. Abigail Reed stood alone in the freezing shadows of the loading dock, watching the only man who had ever truly loved her disappear into the dark, leaving her in the ashes of the world she had burned down. The lease on the townhouse in Chestnut Hill was signed under a blind trust. It was an exquisite property, all vaulted ceilings, white oak floors, and stark natural light. But to Abigail Reed, it felt exactly like a quarantine zone. It had been 3 weeks since the St. Regis. 3 weeks since the board of directors had convened an emergency midnight session, bypassing all standard protocols to demand her immediate, irrevocable resignation. There had been no graceful exit, no golden parachute. The severance negotiations were brutal, bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements designed to protect the hemorrhaging stock price of Reed Pharmaceuticals. The empire she had built was quietly and ruthlessly erasing her from its history. Abigail sat at the expansive marble island in the kitchen, a cup of black tea growing a cold, bitter skin. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and loose trousers. The emerald silk gown from that night was currently sitting at the bottom of a municipal landfill, a casualty of her frantic packing. Her phone, once a relentless, vibrating pulse of demands, high-stakes deals, and absolute power, lay completely silent on the counter. Amanda Foster had blocked her number the morning after the gala. The corporate world, which had once worshipped her calculated brilliance, had excised her with surgical precision. Abigail opened her laptop, the harsh glare of the screen illuminating the new, sharp hollows of her cheeks. A prominent financial blog was open on the browser. The headline read, "The Fall of the Queen, How a Hidden Microphone Shattered Reed Pharmaceuticals." She didn't scroll down to read the article. She simply closed the lid, the soft click echoing loudly in the empty house. The silence surrounding her was absolute and terrifying. There was no board to manipulate, no rival executive to crush, and no husband to anchor her reality. She had treated Samir like a fixed variable, a solid, unmoving foundation she could endlessly exploit while she reached for the sun. Now, the foundation had been violently pulled away, and she was in a free fall that had no bottom. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the perfectly climate-controlled room, realizing she was entirely alone in the dark. 200 miles away, the tires of a rented sedan hissed against the wet asphalt of Interstate 90, pushing steadily westward into the bruised violet twilight. Samir Hassan kept his hands loosely draped over the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the hypnotizing rhythm of the broken white lines. The glowing green numbers of the dashboard clock provided the only light in the cabin. He had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously settling the finalities of a life that no longer existed. The divorce papers had been filed through a proxy lawyer, demanding absolutely nothing in terms of alimony or assets. He had formally resigned from his architectural firm, leaving his shares and his ongoing projects to a junior partner. He had packed his battered leather duffel bag, leaving the $10 million penthouse in Boston exactly as it was, a perfectly curated, temperature-controlled museum to a dead marriage. He reached out and turned the radio off, letting the steady, isolating thrum of the engine fill the silence. He thought back to the St. Regis. He remembered the absolute, paralyzing terror in Abigail's eyes when her own voice had echoed through the ballroom. For months, he had fueled his survival with the precise, burning calculation of that exact moment. He had expected the execution of his plan to bring a surge of profound relief, a reclamation of his stolen dignity. Instead, looking out at the endless, darkening highway, Samir felt nothing but an exhausting, hollow ache in his chest. He had brought the architect of his pain to her knees. He had burned the Reed empire to the ground. But the fire he had started had consumed him in the process. The loving, devoted husband was dead, but so was the man who believed in the inherent goodness of building things. To destroy her, he had been forced to become a monster himself. Samir pulled his phone from the center console. He unlocked the screen, navigated to the hidden audio folder, and highlighted the meticulously edited files of his wife's betrayal. With a single press of his thumb, he permanently deleted them. The digital ghosts vanished into the ether. He set the phone down and looked straight ahead. The road stretched into the American night, offering no destination, only distance. Samir pressed the accelerator, driving deeper into the shadows, leaving nothing but ashes in his wake.